They call it the end of the line. A place where music echoes through stone walls, and death sentences wait behind locked doors. Where Pulitzer-winning journalists share cells with lifers, and hope coexists with despair. Welcome to San Quentin State Prison, California's oldest penitentiary, and the last stop for over 700 men on death row. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps us continue bringing you the real stories hidden behind America's most infamous walls. San Quentin isn't just a prison. It's a time capsule of American justice. A mirror reflecting more than 170 years of punishment, politics, and the human spirit. Perched on the edge of the San Francisco Bay, the prison's tan stone walls rise like a fortress out of another century. Fog rolls over the water in the mornings, brushing against the towers where guards once held rifles ready. Inmates call it the Q. To some it's hell on earth. To others it's the only home they've ever known. San Quentin was founded in 1852, during the height of California's gold rush, when lawlessness ruled the frontier. The state needed a place to hold its growing population of criminals. So they bought a prison ship named the Wobbin, anchored it in the bay, and used it to cage men until the land facility could be built. That was the seed of San Quentin, a place literally born on water and destined to carry the weight of history. By the late 1800s the prison grew fast. Wooden cells became stone. Iron doors slammed shut behind thousands of men, murderers, robbers, petty thieves, and political agitators. The architecture was meant to intimidate. Narrow windows, echoing halls, thick concrete floors. Everything was designed to remind you, freedom was on the other side of the gate and you were not. Executions began early in San Quentin's story. At first, hangings took place in the yard, witnessed by crowds of guards and officials. Later, in 1938, California introduced the gas chamber, a small, steel room where hundreds of men would take their final breath under the eyes of the state. That chamber still stands today. Cold, silent, preserved as a monument to the darkest part of justice. Yet even as death defined its legacy, something unexpected started to grow inside those walls: creativity. By the 1940s and 1950s, inmates began publishing newsletters, forming debate clubs, and even performing music. One of the earliest prison newspapers in America was born here, the San Quentin News, written, edited, and printed by inmates themselves. It gave voice to those society had buried, offering stories of reform, art, and survival. In an era when prisoners were often treated as disposable, San Quentin became an unlikely hub of self-expression. Still, the contradictions were everywhere. One cell block might host a jazz concert, another might erupt into violence before nightfall. Guards patrolled the same corridors where guitars strummed and typewriters clicked. Every sound echoed, every silence carried weight. By the 1960s, the world outside was changing fast. Civil rights marches, protests, and the rise of new movements for equality. Those currents crashed right through San Quentin's gates. Inmates began demanding better conditions, fair treatment, and access to education. But the fight for dignity often met with brutal resistance. The 1960s and 1970s would mark San Quentin's bloodiest decades. Riots, lockdowns, and famous confrontations, including the death of revolutionary writer George Jackson in 1971, turned the prison into a national symbol of rebellion and reform. Television crews and reporters flooded in. The world was watching. And suddenly, San Quentin wasn't just a prison, it was a stage. Outside the walls, California debated punishment versus rehabilitation. Inside, men lived the consequences of every political decision, every law signed in Sacramento, every shift in public opinion about crime and justice. For those on death row, time itself became the enemy. Some waited decades for execution dates that never came. Others found peace in art, writing, or religion. In one of the most paradoxical corners of America, the condemned learned to create beauty, even while living under the shadow of death. San Quentin stands at the intersection of two American obsessions: justice and redemption. And both have left scars. Today, its yard still fills with the sounds of basketballs bouncing, laughter, and the distant hum of San Francisco traffic drifting over the water. It's a place that contains every contradiction this country has ever had: cruelty and compassion, despair and hope, punishment and possibility. San Quentin has seen it all. And this is where our story begins. There's a hallway in San Quentin where the air itself feels heavier. Guards call it the row. Inmates call it the tier of silence. It's where California keeps the men it has condemned to die. San Quentin's death row is the largest in the United States. More than 700 prisoners live here, stacked in cells no wider than a coffin lid turned sideways. Each man has his own space, 6 by 9 feet, concrete walls, steel bars, and a view of nothing but the next cell across. There's no mistaking where you are. The doors are solid. The lights never truly dim. And the smell of metal, sweat, and time mixes with the constant hum of fluorescent bulbs. Some men spend decades here. They age into ghosts long before the state ever carries out their sentence. Others find ways to survive, writing poetry, painting, studying law. In the strange stillness of death row, creativity becomes the only rebellion left. The gas chamber, that infamous steel dome of green paint, once sat only a few steps away. Built in 1938, it replaced public hangings. Over the next 6 decades, hundreds of executions took place there, from serial killers to one-time offenders whose names history has forgotten. Each execution was witnessed by journalists, doctors, and officials. It was meant to be clinical, justice, not revenge, but everyone who walked out described the same thing: the smell of death mixed with detergent and fear. Then came 1996, when California switched to lethal injection. The gas chamber doors closed for good, but the ritual stayed the same. Men were still led down the same narrow hallway, their final walk echoing through steel. Some prayed. Some cursed. Some stayed silent. Among the most infamous names housed here were Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, Charles Ng, and Scott Peterson. Each case drew global attention, and each time, San Quentin's image burned deeper into the public imagination. People saw it as a symbol of justice, or of everything broken in the system depending on where you stood. But behind the headlines, daily life on death row moves with eerie routine. Wake up at dawn. Count time. Breakfast through a slot. No group meals. No yard together. Each man walks alone in a small cage during his exercise hour, under the watch of armed guards. The rhythm never changes. And yet life persists. Some inmates become paralegals, fighting their own appeals. Others mentor younger prisoners through letters. There's even a spiritual community here: volunteers, chaplains, and visiting rabbis who come to talk about redemption in a place built for endings. A few men record their stories for podcasts and prison radio. One of the most famous is Ear Hustle, produced inside San Quentin by inmates and journalists. It began in 2017 and quickly earned national awards. A raw, unfiltered look at life inside. For the first time, listeners outside could hear the voices of those who were never supposed to be heard again. One inmate once said, "You stop being afraid of death after the first 5 years. After that, you just start being afraid of forgetting who you are." That's the quiet tragedy of San Quentin's row, not the executions but the waiting. Since 2006, no one has been executed in California. Legal challenges, changing politics, and public opinion have frozen the process. In 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom officially suspended the death penalty and ordered the chamber dismantled. But the prisoners remain, their sentences untouched. They live in a limbo, condemned but not dying. Each cell holds a story. Some are guilty of unspeakable crimes. Others maintain innocence, clinging to appeals and letters from families who never stopped believing. Together, they form a kind of silent city within the prison. One that California itself doesn't quite know what to do with. Death row at San Quentin is more than a punishment. It's a question America keeps asking itself. Do we seek justice, or do we simply seek closure? And while that question hangs unanswered, the men inside keep writing, praying, and waiting. Waiting for a system that no longer knows how to finish what it started. By the late 1960s, San Quentin had become a pressure cooker. The country was burning: protests in the streets, civil rights marches, assassinations, and a growing anger about inequality. And behind the prison walls, that same fire was spreading. Inside the queue, overcrowding was severe. Cells meant for one man now held two. Tensions between races, black, white, Latino, grew by the day. Guards were often veterans of war, hardened and suspicious. Many inmates were young, radical, and politicized. It was a perfect storm waiting to explode. Among the voices rising from inside was George Jackson. Convicted in 1961 for a $70 gas station robbery, he was sentenced to 1 year to life, a sentence that gave the state total control over when he would be released. Years turned into a decade. In those years, Jackson transformed. He devoured books, Marx, Fanon, Lenin, and began to write. His letters from prison would later be published as Soledad Brother, a powerful indictment of racism and injustice in America's prisons. To fellow inmates, Jackson wasn't just another prisoner, he was a teacher, a revolutionary. He believed prisons weren't just cages but factories for rebellion. And in San Quentin, his ideas found fertile ground. By 1970, the tension reached a breaking point. The killing of 3 black inmates at Soledad Prison sparked outrage. When a guard was later killed in retaliation, Jackson and 2 others, Fleta Drungo and John Clutchette, were accused of murder. They became known as the Soledad Brothers, and their trial turned into a national cause. Celebrities, activists, and college students rallied for their release, believing they were victims of a racist system. But while the world protested, San Quentin tightened. Guards increased searches, punishment cells filled up, and trust vanished. Then came August 21, 1971, the day everything changed. That morning, George Jackson met with his attorney in the prison's adjustment center. Moments later, chaos erupted. Gunfire, shouts, smoke and confusion. By the time it ended, 6 men were dead, 3 guards, 2 white inmates, and George Jackson himself, shot in the yard while allegedly attempting to escape. His body lay near the wall, a gun beside him. Though to this day, how that weapon entered the prison remains one of California's enduring mysteries. News of Jackson's death sparked riots and protests across the country. A few weeks later, at Attica Prison in New York, inmates seized control of an entire facility, demanding reforms, citing George Jackson's death as the spark. In many ways, San Quentin had become the epicenter of a national movement. Inside its walls, the aftermath was brutal. Cells were torn apart, men beaten, books burned, letters confiscated. The dream of reform seemed crushed under the weight of fear. Yet even then, Jackson's legacy survived, in whispered conversations, hidden notebooks, and the determination of prisoners who refused to be silent. Through the 1970s, violence continued to shadow San Quentin. Gangs grew stronger. Racial divisions hardened. Each tier was claimed by one group or another: Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, Mexican Mafia. Lines were drawn not with fences but with blood. For guards, it became one of the most dangerous jobs in America. For inmates, it was survival of the fittest. Every day, every meal, every walk to the yard could be your last. And yet, within this chaos, voices kept rising. Writers, artists, and activists continued to emerge from San Quentin's depths, refusing to let brutality define them completely. By the end of the decade, California's prison system was in crisis. Lockdowns were constant. Riots flared in Folsom, Soledad, and back again at San Quentin. The public demanded order, politicians demanded toughness, and the idea of rehabilitation, once central to reform, began to fade. But not everyone gave up. Even in those blood years, a handful of programs tried to survive. Prison newspapers, education classes, and art workshops that gave inmates a reason to hope. Because no matter how violent the era became, one truth remained: every riot, every lockdown, every act of rebellion was a message from men society refused to hear. The blood years had left San Quentin scarred, but not silent. It was still breathing, still watching, still waiting for what would come next, an uncertain balance between fear and freedom. When the smoke finally cleared from the blood years, San Quentin was left shaken, but alive. The prison that had once symbolized chaos and death began, slowly, to change. Not because the system wanted it, but because the people inside demanded it. By the 1980s, America's prisons were swelling. Tough on crime laws and the war on drugs filled cell after cell. San Quentin, already overcrowded, now held nearly twice its intended population. Violence remained common, but under the surface, a quiet revolution had begun, not of weapons but of words. It started with something small: education. College volunteers from nearby UC Berkeley and San Francisco State began entering the prison to teach. Classes on writing, journalism, and sociology replaced idle hours with purpose. For the first time, men who had spent decades behind bars were learning how to tell their own stories, and the outside world was starting to listen. Then came the San Quentin News revival. Inmates wrote, edited, and published their own paper, stories about parole, reform, sports, and even politics. It was bold. It was dangerous. And it became one of the few prison newspapers officially recognized and distributed in the United States. Through its pages, San Quentin's inmates became journalists, chronicling the world that most people preferred not to see. Music also made a comeback. Prison bands began performing again, blending blues, jazz, and soul. You could hear echoes of guitars through the yard during recreation hours, faint, imperfect, but full of life. In 1985, the San Quentin Blues Band performed a concert that became legendary inside those walls. The same yard that had seen riots was now filled with applause. Even Hollywood returned. Film crews came to shoot documentaries, drawn by the contradictions of a prison trying to reform itself while still housing California's most dangerous men. The camera captured everything: The cold cells, the laughter, the prayers, the music. The world was beginning to see San Quentin not just as a place of punishment, but as a place of transformation. Still, the darkness never disappeared entirely. Gang rivalries simmered. Drugs flowed through hidden channels. And the weight of death row continued to cast its long shadow over the rest of the prison. But for every step backward, there was a flicker of progress. In 2009, something remarkable happened. A small media team formed inside the prison and began recording stories directly from the inmates themselves. They called it ear hustle, prison slang for eavesdropping. It was a podcast produced by Nigel Poor, a Bay Area artist, and Erlen Woods, an inmate serving a 31 years to life sentence. With nothing but a microphone and honesty, they turned everyday prison life into a national conversation. The world outside listened. Ear Hustle became a hit, downloaded millions of times, even nominated for a Pulitzer. Listeners heard stories about cellmates, lost love, second chances, and daily survival, the kind of humanity no headline could ever show. It was history in real time. San Quentin, the same place once known for riots and executions, now producing award-winning journalism from behind bars. Education, art, and storytelling were reshaping the identity of the prison. And something unexpected began to happen. Volunteers, professors, journalists, filmmakers, started arriving in droves, teaching, mentoring, and collaborating with the men inside. For many inmates, this was the first time anyone had looked at them and seen potential instead of failure. One lifer said it best during a graduation ceremony inside the chapel. "I came to San Quentin broken. But this place taught me that punishment doesn't end your story. It only starts a new chapter if you're willing to write it." These changes didn't erase the past. The ghosts of George Jackson, of riots and executions, still lingered in every hallway. But a new spirit was taking hold, one built not on rebellion but on redemption. By the 2010s, San Quentin had become a model of experimentation. The prison offered coding programs, filmmaking workshops, journalism classes, and even The Last Mile, a project teaching inmates how to start tech companies. Some graduates went on to find real jobs after release, an idea that would have been unthinkable decades earlier. Reporters started calling San Quentin the most progressive prison in America. It was still surrounded by razor wire, still filled with lifers, but for the first time in its 170-year history, it felt alive with something other than fear. And yet, the question remained. Could a place built on death and punishment truly become a place of second chances? That question would be tested again in the years to come, when a global crisis hit and San Quentin faced its darkest test in decades. By the start of 2020, San Quentin was still one of California's most talked about prisons, a living contradiction of punishment and possibility. The yard was alive with energy, basketball games, music rehearsals, and volunteers walking through the gates every week to teach. Programs were running strong, and hope, fragile but real, had found its way into the cells. Then the world changed. And for the men inside San Quentin, that change felt like the walls were closing in all over again. In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the United States. Businesses closed. Streets emptied. But in places like San Quentin, isolation wasn't new, it was just amplified. Masks, testing, lockdowns, they all arrived too late. Early that summer, in an attempt to prevent outbreaks, officials transferred prisoners from another facility that already had confirmed COVID cases. That single decision would turn San Quentin into the site of one of the worst prison outbreaks in American history. Within weeks, the virus spread like wildfire through the aging cell blocks. Ventilation was poor. Cells were stacked in tiers, open bars facing narrow walkways where the air never moved. By mid-July, more than two-thirds of the prison's population had tested positive. Guards fell sick. Medics worked around the clock. The sound of coughs and ambulance sirens replaced the usual echoes of the yard. For inmates, fear became the new lockdown. Programs stopped. Visits stopped. The very lifeline of rehabilitation, contact with the outside world, was cut. Even the San Quentin News halted publication for the first time in decades. Those who once wrote about reform were now writing wills and goodbye letters. Some inmates turned their cells into makeshift hospitals. Others prayed through the night, coughing behind masks made from torn bedsheets. Guards in hazmat suits walked the tiers, shouting instructions over the hum of industrial fans. For months, the prison stood frozen in a nightmare no one could escape. By the end of 2020, 28 prisoners and one staff member had died, and hundreds more had been hospitalized. It was a humanitarian crisis behind stone walls, one that shocked even those who believed they'd seen everything. News outlets across the country called San Quentin Ground Zero, for prison mismanagement during the pandemic. Families of inmates protested outside the gates, holding signs that read, "Their sentence wasn't death by neglect." The tragedy forced California to confront an uncomfortable truth. When a virus spreads inside a prison, it doesn't stay there. Guards carried it home. Hospitals overflowed. And for the first time in years, public debate shifted, from punishment to protection, from incarceration to health. In the aftermath, change began again. Advocates pushed for early releases, new health standards, and a long-delayed recognition that incarceration is also a public health issue. San Quentin became a test case for reform once more, not by choice but by crisis. Inside, survivors described the pandemic as a second sentence. One inmate wrote, "I used to dream of parole. Now I just dream of breathing freely." Yet even in those months of despair, creativity refused to die. When restrictions eased, ear hustle returned to the airwaves, broadcasting stories of loss, fear, and resilience from inside quarantine. Listeners outside said it was haunting, the sound of real voices trapped in history. By 2021, vaccines arrived. Gradually, the prison reopened. Programs restarted, classrooms filled again, and the yard echoed once more with the hum of life. But nothing felt the same. San Quentin had changed, not just physically but spiritually. The pandemic stripped the place bare, revealing the fragility beneath the iron bars. The state of California announced new plans to transform San Quentin from a maximum security fortress into a center for rehabilitation and education. Governor Newsom called it the San Quentin Transformation Initiative. The goal was radical: to replace the culture of punishment with one of opportunity. Workshops, college degrees, trade programs, even a media center, all inside the same walls that once echoed with executions. For many it sounded like redemption. For others it felt impossible. Could America's oldest prison, the one built to cage and condemn, truly become a model for change? San Quentin's story wasn't ending. It was rewriting itself, again. By 2023, San Quentin's name had re-entered the headlines, not for riots, not for executions, but for something almost unthinkable. California's governor stood before the gates and announced a plan that stunned the nation. The state's oldest and most notorious prison would be transformed into something entirely new. Not a penitentiary, a rehabilitation campus. It was called the San Quentin Transformation Initiative, a $360 million vision to turn the prison once known for death row into the future of criminal justice reform. The goal: replace retribution with restoration, fear with education, and cages with classrooms. For a place that had seen 170 years of executions, riots, and despair, it sounded like a miracle. But it wasn't just politics, it was personal. The pandemic had exposed every weakness in the system: overcrowding, inhumane conditions, and an outdated model of incarceration that simply didn't work. So, California decided to make San Quentin the experiment. Architects, educators, and correctional experts were brought in from around the world. Some came from Norway, where prisons focus on rehabilitation and trust instead of punishment. They studied the structure, the old tiers, and the cracked floors, asking a simple question: what if we turn this place of pain into a place of possibility? Plans began to take shape. The transformation would remove traditional cells in certain areas and replace them with learning pods, spaces for coding, carpentry, and film editing. The yard, once infamous for violence, would host education fairs, mentoring circles, and entrepreneurship workshops. Even the old death row complex, where hundreds had once awaited execution, was set to become a training center for job skills and rehabilitation programs. The shift was not just physical, it was philosophical. For more than a century, America had built prisons to isolate and punish. Now, in the shadow of San Francisco's skyline, one prison dared to imagine something else: healing. Many guards were skeptical. Some politicians called it too soft. They remembered the riots, the blood, the chaos of the past. But inside the prison the mood was different. For the men serving time, hope, real, tangible hope, had entered the conversation. One inmate said during a public tour, "They used to build prisons to break us. Now maybe they're trying to build something that can help us stand back up." Programs like The Last Mile expanded, teaching coding, web design, and entrepreneurship. Graduates who once wore blue prison uniforms now worked for tech companies across California after their release. Other programs brought in filmmakers, journalists, and writers who collaborated directly with inmates to document their stories. The lines between inside and outside began to blur. Volunteers returned in record numbers. University professors taught psychology, law, and ethics. Musicians performed live concerts in the chapel. And the Prison Media Center, now one of the most advanced of its kind in the U.S. correctional system, became a hub of storytelling. Ear Hustle kept recording, San Quentin News kept publishing, and a new generation of inmates learned to use words and media as tools for change. Even the architecture itself began to reflect the shift. Designers proposed open spaces, more natural light, and communal areas built around dignity rather than domination. The blueprint drew inspiration from Norway's Halden Prison, often called the world's most humane facility. The message was clear. Rehabilitation doesn't mean leniency, it means rebuilding people who can return to society as something better than what they were. The transformation wasn't without controversy. Families of crime victims questioned whether the focus on compassion went too far. Tough-on-crime advocates warned that soft justice would fail. But others, judges, activists, even former guards, began to see that San Quentin's evolution was more than an experiment. It was a statement. A statement that even the darkest places can change. That a prison born in 1852, once home to the gas chamber, riots, and death, could now become a beacon of reform in the 21st century. Governor Newsom said it plainly. We can't keep doing the same thing and expect different results. San Quentin will be the place where California proves there's a better way. For many inmates, those words meant everything. For others, they were a reminder that change takes time and trust. But one truth was undeniable. San Quentin was no longer just a prison. It was a living experiment in redemption. And that transformation was only the beginning. Every prison has bars, but not every prison has voices that carry beyond them. San Quentin's greatest transformation didn't come from politicians or architects. It came from the people living inside. Some of them had been locked up since the 1980s, men who had known only concrete, noise, and survival. Yet over the years, something remarkable happened. They began to change the story from within. Take Earlonne Woods, co-creator of Ear Hustle. Once serving a life sentence, he began recording daily life in San Quentin. Conversations in the yard, debates over food, moments of humor and heartbreak. The podcast humanized people the public had written off as monsters. When Wood's sentence was commuted in 2018, he walked out the same gate he had once been escorted through in chains. Only this time he was free and his voice was already famous worldwide. Then there's Tommy Shakur Ross, who helped teach journalism and co-produced stories that aired on NPR. He once said, "We used to be known for breaking rules. Now we're known for breaking stereotypes." That's the quiet revolution taking place behind those walls, transformation not by decree but by example. Even guards began to see the change. Many correctional officers who'd worked through the dark years admitted the atmosphere was different now, calmer, more focused, even hopeful. Programs gave inmates reasons to wake up with purpose, and that purpose spread. Violence dropped. Education rose. And the sound of keys jingling down the hall no longer meant fear, it meant the next class was about to start. The prison yard itself tells the story. Where there was once tension and separation by race, there are now circles of men sitting together, discussing forgiveness, poetry, or coding. Basketball games are still played hard, but they end with handshakes, not blades. The walls haven't disappeared, but the distance between people has. San Quentin has become a paradox in motion, a place of punishment reborn as a workshop for second chances. It's still under heavy guard, still bound by laws and fences. But the spirit inside feels different. Almost like a campus, a community, or maybe even a small city determined to redefine what justice looks like. Inmate artists paint murals of freedom and remembrance. Lifers mentor younger inmates on how to stay out of trouble. And on visiting days, families walk through the gates with tears in their eyes, not from shame, but from the realization that the person they once feared losing forever is slowly finding himself again. San Quentin's story isn't perfect. There are still moments of violence, still stories of failure, still the shadow of death row, now mostly empty but never forgotten. Yet the transformation unfolding here is undeniable. In a nation where over 2 million people are incarcerated, this single prison has become a symbol, proof that even a place built on despair can evolve into something hopeful. One inmate said during a radio interview, "They built this place to end lives. But somehow it's helping us rebuild ours." That line captures everything San Quentin has become, a contradiction, a warning, and a light. From its birth in 1852 on a floating prison ship, to the riots of the 1970s, the silence of death row, the chaos of the pandemic, and now, the blueprints of transformation. San Quentin has lived every chapter of America's justice story. It's been a symbol of vengeance, a stage for revolution, and now a laboratory for redemption. Inside its walls are thousands of men, some guilty beyond question, others shaped by circumstance, all bound by one truth. Change is possible even here. Because the real story of San Quentin isn't about the executions or the riots. It's about survival, art, forgiveness, and the human ability to evolve. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep telling the untold truths behind the walls society tries to forget. This has been San Quentin, Between Redemption and the Rope. A story about the oldest prison in California. And the newest hope for what justice can become.